The first thing that I always recommend you do is just to read through your premises, read your conclusion, and try to reason through or think through the argument informally. In this case, the first premise tells you that if A, then B. If A, then not B. Now, this may seem very surprising. This may even seem puzzling, but actually, this is a really important piece of information. If you think about what these two premises together tells us, it tells us that A has to be false. That is to say, not A. After all, if A is true, then B is true. But if A is true, then not B is also true. These two, however, contradict each other. A then leads to a contradiction. And if A leads to a contradiction, then A itself has to also be false. Now, this is a very, very helpful and productive piece of information, because our third premise says, if we know that not A happens, then G happens. And of course, G is our desired conclusion. And so at least on this line of reasoning, it would appear that eventually we're going to want to use modus ponens to derive our desired conclusion. In a lot of cases, when you think through the proof this way, you get basically an outline for the proof to follow, and it's just a matter of fitting rules to your observations. This proof is a little trickier because we don't appear to have rules that let us do what we did here. And so we have to look for plan B. And the first version of plan B is really doing whatever you legally can, but guided by what you think will be productive. And what we think will be productive is trying to derive not A so that we can use modus ponens with a third premise. So how can we possibly derive not A from 1 and 2 or 3? This is where the do what you legally can kicks in. Sometimes manipulating some of the sentences, especially with the replacement rules, just gives you different looks at the ingredients. For example, you might try transposition on line 1, not because you immediately anticipate that it will get you not A, but just because it's something that you can do to give you a different look. And here we see that this different look actually allows us to make progress in the proof. This sentence here hooks up, if you will, with the second premise. Using HS. Now again, does this get us any closer to tilde A? Maybe, maybe not. It's something that you can legally do, and it gets us a different look. And it gets us a little bit closer to what we think we want. Clearly, this is still a conditional, but at least we've gotten, if you will, rid of the B's, and we now just have A's. This next line isn't easy to anticipate, but it is still a process of doing what you can do legally while keeping an eye on our intermediate goal. At line 5, if A, then not A. It's a conditional. One of the things that we can legally do with conditionals is that we can turn them into wedges using implication. And if we can get this far, then we're on the home stretch of this proof. Tautology allows us to derive our desired intermediate conclusion. And we were looking for that intermediate conclusion because we were going to use modus ponens on lines 3 and the line that contained tilde A to derive G. So this is one way to approach this proof. It's a little bit of a mix of reading through or understanding what the argument is providing you with, and also doing whatever you legally can with an eye towards either your main goal or an intermediate goal. The second proof strategy involves, there are two features of this proof that indicate that IP is going to be productive here. First is the nature of the desired conclusion. Whenever your conclusion has an opposite that is easy to work with, then IP is a candidate. Not only is not G a simple enough sentence that it's easy to work with, but we can perhaps immediately anticipate being able to use the assumption for indirect proof. We can see that not G is going to be useful with premise 3 and modus tollens. The other indication that IP might be useful here is the fact that we got a little stuck. IP works for every single valid argument. It may not always result in the easiest or the shortest proof, but if you think about the definition of validity, if you think about what a proof does, and you think about how the rule IP works, you can see how IP works for every single valid argument in existence. In fact, there's a little bit of a practice tip here. If you want extra practice, you can go back through all the old proofs and try doing them using IP or possibly CP. So how do we do this proof as an IP proof? Well, you start with the assumption for indirect proof of the opposite of your desired conclusion. And since we're handwriting this, it's easy enough to indent and to drop a line to visually remind us that we are in a subproof and the subproof rules apply here. If you're typing or you don't need these reminders, it's okay not to indent, but it does help you keep track of the fact that you are in a subproof. After making the assumption for indirect proof, the proof proceeds however we see it. In this case, modus tollens is the next most obvious step, and we're back in business with our original notes. After all, tilde tilde A is equivalent to A. We knew that if A, then B, and if A, not B, and that these sentences contradict each other, and that means we can step out or close our subproof and derive our desired conclusion, citing the entire subproof. Strategy number 3 is actually an advanced case of indirect proof, but it shows up very naturally here because of the reasoning that we did at this stage. We know that if we were to assume A for indirect proof, we would be able to derive a contradiction and therefore derive not A using IP. There is an advanced strategy, in other words, that goes like this. Use IP when you know that you can derive a sentence, but you don't know how else to derive it. Now, crucial to the strategy is that you have to know that you can derive a sentence. If you are only guessing that you can derive that sentence, or you just want that sentence but you don't know that you can derive it, then you don't know that you can generate a contradiction by assuming the sentence is opposite. And so then IP is no sure strategy. If, however, you know that you can derive a sentence, like we know here, we know that not A follows from premises 1 and 2. We're just not sure how to get there. Then you can use IP safely. To do that, the structure of the proof proceeds normally. Best practice, you would indent. For typing, you don't necessarily need to indent. And you would assume the opposite of what you know you can derive and label it an assumption for indirect proof. You would then proceed with the proof. Here, we're deriving B using modus ponens, and then not B using modus ponens. Now we've got our contradictory statements here. We simply use conjunction then, to derive the explicit statement of the contradiction, and that allows us to close the subproof citing IP and the entire subproof, and that allows us to derive our desired conclusion from 3 and 8. IP is incredibly useful. It's incredibly powerful. IP works for every valid argument. And if you know that you can derive a sentence, but you don't know how else to derive it, you can always try to use IP.